Right, well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this workshop. What has mediation ever done for us? Providing a professional service to the courts. We've got a panel of three people presenting the workshop. We've got Heloise Murdoch, who's the court mediation coordinator at the Citizens Advice Edinburgh, and she looks after the Edinburgh Court Mediation Service. We've got Summary Sheriff Michael Hanlon, who's a sheriff in Kilmarnock, the Kilmarnock Sheriff Court, and he deals with, amongst other matters, the simple procedure cases at that court. And I'm the third member of the panel. I'm a lead mediator with the University Clinic, and I do mediations generally in the clinic, but I actually look after the Kilmarnock court as a sort of a separate project in the clinic. So I deal with all the matters coming from Kilmarnock. What we're going to do is we're going to ask Heloise first, and then Sheriff Michael Hanlon, and then I will give you a short presentation as to how we run these services and what we do, and then we will hand over to all of you to ask us any questions that you would like to. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Heloise to tell us about the Edinburgh Sheriff Court and the mediation service that she coordinates there.
Okay, thank you, Patrick, and hello everyone. My name is Heloise Murdoch, and I run what used to be Edinburgh Sheriff Court Mediation Service, now Lothian and Borders Sheriff Court Mediation Services. We were initially just based in Edinburgh, and now we're covering Livingston, Selkirk and Jedburgh Sheriff Courts as well. So I just want to talk about the day-to-day way the mediation service is run, and the journey from referral to mediation, and the challenge of continuing to offer mediation during the pandemic. I've also put in with the conference papers just a 3-monthly sort of snapshot of our statistics and feedback stats from the parties who'd used the service. Just a little bit of history of the mediation service. Has been running in Edinburgh Sheriff Court since 1998 and is also run in conjunction with an in-court advice service, which offers advice and assistance to unrepresented litigants in simple procedure cases. So both these services are funded by Scottish Legal Aid Board and managed by Citizens Advice Edinburgh. So the mediation service offers parties the opportunity for a more flexible, cheaper, confidential form of dispute resolution, where they can remain in control of their cases, explore different solutions, maintain ongoing relationships, and basically examine their needs and their interests. We receive all our referrals directly from the sheriff, mainly in the form of first written orders, occasionally at case management discussions. All our cases are simple procedure cases, which involve amounts of money up to £5,000. A lot of the types of cases that we deal with are consumer, tradespeople, factoring, small business debt. That's probably lots of used cars, seems to be quite a common one, building work, a lot of consumer issues. Once the sheriff has issued the written order recommending to parties that they engage with the mediation service, I get the court papers from the Sheriff Clerk's office, we work quite closely with. I'll then assess whether I think the case is suitable for mediation, and I'll write to the parties and offer them a mediation date which they need to opt out of, and ask them to contact, if they wish, and ask them to contact me directly. When I do contact them, then I'll explain the mediation process to them, answer any questions they might have, maybe ask them if there's any further information they can supply, and just have a general assessment of the case and make sure the parties have information about mediation. As this, I find often in our feedback stats, it revealed that 80% of parties who'd used the service, this was their first experience of mediation. So there doesn't seem to be and often they didn't really have a general knowledge or awareness of the process. So I think that's important to have that initial pre-mediation meeting with them. Once there's a date set for mediation, then I'll contact our team of volunteer mediators. It's a very similar setup as Charlie was speaking about earlier, in that we generally practice co-mediation. All our mediators are accredited and trained. When people first join the mediation panel, we ask that they do at least 4 mediations as an assistant to a lead mediator, after which they'll have an observation and they can proceed to be a lead mediator then, should they so wish and feel ready to do so. So once I've allocated 2 mediators to the case, we've set the date, I will send the parties out an agreement to mediate for the parties and the mediators to sign. We were doing all our mediations, the majority of our mediations were face-to-face. Now, since the pandemic, it's mainly Zoom with the odd conference call. We did offer Zoom previously, but there was a very low uptake of it. And I think with many people, it was quite unfamiliar. I think now a lot more people are used to using that, and I've been quite pleasantly surprised how successful Zoom mediations have been. I suppose they've got the benefit of we can reach a much bigger geographical location. Parties don't have travel costs. They can be a little bit more flexible with time constraints. People are more comfortable being in their own home. I mean, a downside is that people aren't always used to the technology, but I'll offer people a practice run first to help them get it set up. And then there's always the option of a conference call if they don't want to go ahead with Zoom. But talking to parties following Zoom mediations, it seems to be if they had some reservations about it, they've generally found the experience to be very positive. So I think that's something we will continue to offer even when we go back to face-to-face mediations. Okay, at the mediation itself, if the parties reach an agreement, the mediators will help them write that up on screen. And then I'll send the settlement agreement to them straight after the mediation for an electronic signature. The mediators will check during the mediation that they've both agreed to those particular terms. I'll send out a copy of the settlement agreement and then I'll monitor the settlements until it's been carried out, just to make sure that the settlement's complied with. Once it has been, I'll send both parties a dismissal form out, which we'll pass to the Sheriff Clerk to arrange dismissal of the case. If the case doesn't settle, then I'll return it to the court where it's likely that the Sheriff will assign a hearing. And we find often that even if cases don't settle, they'll often settle later before the hearing. And often the mediation has been useful as a way of narrowing down the issues, and just generally having that discussion has been generally been a positive thing. So after the mediation, the mediators will also complete a reflective case report. So I believe that Charlie showed a copy of this earlier. So yeah, I mean, that's basically the mediation process in a nutshell. I don't know if you've got any questions to ask afterwards. I'd be quite happy to answer them. Oh, if I could just add, according to just a brief note of our feedback statistics. I mean, our success rate in the last quarter was 76%. It's normally between 70 and 80% throughout the history of the service. So considering it was almost completely Zoom mediations in the last quarter, so that was quite positive to show the settlement rate hadn't gone down. 39 in our feedback, 39% of people rated mediation service as excellent, 51% as very good, and 10% as good. So I mean, those stats are there if anyone wants to have a look at them. It's generally been quite positive feedback from parties. But I'll hand back over to you now, Patrick, if that's okay.
Thanks, Heloise. Thank you for that. We have got a question in from Victoria. we'll get to the questions at the end of the presentation. So if anybody else has got any questions, you can either send them in the chat box, but you can also just ask them at the end of the presentation. So whichever way you would prefer. Right. Now we're going to ask Sheriff Michael Hanlon to tell us a bit about the mediation process from his side, being sitting on the bench in the simple procedure court. So can we hand over to you, please, Michael?
Yes, thank you, Patrick. Good afternoon, everybody. I thought it might be helpful just to start by giving a little bit of a background as to the framework within which the sheriffs are operating. The mediation process that we deal with mostly in the courts is through the simple procedure, which was introduced in November 2016. I was installed as a sheriff in April 2017, so I was one of the first kind of group of sheriffs to deal with these new rules and how they operate. Simple procedure deals with claims of up to £5,000. It tends to be common areas of law such as debt issues, or perhaps people who are not happy with the work that's been done by tradesmen in the house, but isn't always as straightforward as that. While it's called simple procedure, some of the issues of law that it throws up can be quite complicated. But whatever issues come up, the rules themselves embed the idea of alternative dispute resolution. I'm going to go through a brief outline of some of the rules that are relevant. If anyone's more interested in this, I'm sure you'll be dying to read them, but the simple procedure rules are available. If you do a quick Google search, they're available on the Scottish Courts website, but they're available elsewhere. But it's interesting if you are looking at how mediation's kind of coming into the court process, it's really written into the rules. So from the principles, Rule 1.2 makes it clear that parties are to be encouraged to settle their disputes through negotiation or alternative dispute resolution. My responsibilities are written into the rules and set out that it's mandatory, I must encourage parties to try and resolve things by negotiation or alternative dispute resolution. Parties' responsibilities include considering that's written into the rules. It's also written into the rules that they must approach any negotiation or alternative dispute resolution with an open and constructive attitude. Doesn't tell me how I'm supposed to judge whether they're doing that, but they have to anyway. And I have very wide powers. All the sheriffs have very wide powers. They can do anything or give any order considered necessary to encourage negotiation. And this applies right the way through proceedings. So from first written orders, that's when a sheriff will get the paperwork for a case in front of him or her, and will look at them and decide what's to happen with the case and give out orders. So the very first written order can be to refer parties to alternative dispute resolution. As Heloise says, that seems to be happening quite often in Edinburgh Sheriff Court. Thereafter, what happens is there's a case management discussion where parties come together in front of the sheriff and discuss the issues in the case. And again, I have a duty to raise the prospect of alternative dispute resolution. And after the case management discussion in court, I can again refer parties to mediation. And it doesn't stop there. If the case doesn't resolve at that stage and goes to an evidential hearing, even at the stage of an evidential hearing, I have a duty to ask parties as to whether or not they think this can be negotiated, or whether alternative dispute resolution is a possibility. So really, I'm just trying to highlight that all stages of the civil cases under simple procedure that I'm dealing with, I have to look at alternative dispute resolution, and parties are under an obligation to consider it and look and see whether it's a possibility. I'll try and accommodate negotiation myself between parties when they appear in front of me. It is difficult. When we were appearing in courts, I used to have a 30-minute slot for maybe 6 to 10 cases, because the simple procedure cases would call in the same court as the heritable court, where there's a lot of rental issues, and there'd be dozens of cases calling. So to try and properly negotiate a settlement in the space of 5 or 6 minutes, it wasn't very easy. You do sometimes have success. I have on occasion managed to resolve things. I've told parties to go upstairs to the court cafeteria and have a cup of tea and a cake and try and talk their troubles through, and it does work. But more often than not, I have to, mediation is a possibility, look at referring, and that's where Patrick comes in. Patrick offers the service out from Kilmarnock Court. So the way I go about referring cases, on very rare occasions, I will refer cases from first orders. So before I've even seen parties, on some occasions I'll refer for mediation. But I tend to only do that where the written pleadings or letters or emails from parties hint that that's what they want to do. They suggest, well, I would like to talk to them about this, or we've made some offers. If that process looks like it's likely, I will refer to mediation. But more often than not, I will go to the case management discussion, and at that stage try to identify cases which I think might be suitable for mediation. I don't have an exact science for that. There are some cases, such as road traffic accidents, where parties are represented by solicitors. They usually resolve in some way, shape or form. So I'm less likely to refer those. Similarly, a credit card or some debt actions involving bigger banks. They have their own in-house resolution, which can be helpful, and I'm less likely to refer them. So it's usually tradesmen and customer type disputes, or perhaps where there's personal issues underlying what is masked behind a legal claim between family members or friends, where you think that even if you resolve the legal dispute, there are other things underlying it. Or cases where you know that parties are going to have an ongoing relationship, so client customers that are going to keep that relationship going, neighbours, factors on estates. So those kind of situations I will look at and try and persuade parties that they might want to consider mediation. As I do that, I try and, if you like, sell mediation through a carrot and stick technique. I try to make it clear to parties that when a case is referred to mediation, it still stays with the court. Technically, technically the court just pauses the case. And that means a party is not giving up their rights. The claimant in particular is not losing the ability to keep going and sue the other party if that's what they want to do. So the case doesn't go away, but mediation is a process that can take place as it's going on. I try and stress to the parties what the negative outcomes might be. So the claimant, that he has to prove his case, what's involved in presenting evidence and how difficult that can sometimes be, and the possibility that you may get nothing, or she may have to pay expenses. And I might also let the respondent know the effect that it might have on them, that while they may think that there's no claim against them, if there's a possibility and I find against them, they've got a court order which can affect various outcomes in their lives. Credit ratings can be affected and other things, so it may be in their interest to look and see whether mediation can assist them. I stress to them that mediation is informal and allows discussions between them, and importantly, gives them some control over how the matter is resolved and doesn't leave them with a stranger deciding this for them with no real input from them. I stress to them that at the moment, especially under COVID, but actually generally speaking, it can be a quicker process because there is a backlog of cases within the court, and mediation can take place and more straightforward, more quickly, and they may have a resolution by the time any further hearings fixed. I'm reluctant to fix a court hearing where parties, sorry, a mediation process where parties are not willing to engage. It is possible to refer for mediation without their consent, but I have some concerns as to whether or not they're likely to engage. I'm happy to hear from anybody if they think perhaps the opposite might be the case and some form of enforced mediation might assist, but my own view is it's not going to help Patrick, and it's not going to move things through quickly if parties are just completely unwilling to engage. I also, of course, stress to parties that the process is free of charge. And kind of point out to them, what in essence have you got to lose? I'll often say that to parties where they're not sure. I say, well, what have you got to lose from this? The case is still with me. I can still decide it. I'm here anyway, but you've got a free process where you can have some input into this. What's the harm? You have to be careful, I think, sometimes getting people's understanding of what's involved in mediation. It's not unusual for somebody to say to me, of course, I'm willing to go to mediation, as long as they accept that they have to pay me what I'm asking for. I'm happy to discuss whatever they want with me. And I have to kind of say, well, that's not mediation. That's you getting what you want from the off. And mediation is going to have to involve some compromise. That's how the process works. And I also very often have to try and calm the waters before they go to mediation. Excuse me. For example, it's not unusual to have Twitter spats or Facebook spats that have been ongoing before you get to the stage of the court. And very often when I refer them to mediation, I try and say, look, can we leave this alone for a moment? If you're going to enter this process willingly, then really you have to focus on the confidential process, and let's leave it in there just now, and we can bring it back out if we need to. So that's what happens. Cases, once they've been to mediation, either they'll be successful, in which case parties may write to me and let me know, and I'll simply dismiss the case if that's what they want me to do. Or they may write to me or come before me and say, well, we've reached this resolution, but we need some time to put it in place. And in those kind of situations, I will simply continue the case or pause the case until that's done and then dismiss it. And if it doesn't work, then it'll come back to me and I'll fix an evidential hearing. But as Heloise has mentioned, even in cases that go forward to an evidential hearing, the process of mediation can be really helpful in narrowing the issues, perhaps cutting down on the evidence that might otherwise be laid. So that's really a brief overview. Again, I'll be happy to answer any questions, and I'll pass back to Patrick for just now.
Great, thank you for sharing that with us, Michael. Very, very useful, a useful insight into how the mediation process works from your side and from the side of the court. As I mentioned earlier, I've been doing mediations from Kilmarnock for the Strathclyde clinic, and I started, I think it was in December 2019 or in January last year. I basically run that side of the clinic. The clinic at that stage didn't feel that it had the capacity to take on another sheriffdom, so I undertook to look after Kilmarnock myself, but under the auspices of the clinic. So the mediations are still done as proper clinic mediations, and I do from time to time have student mediators and observers who are students who start the master's course who haven't yet progressed to become student mediators. Since I started in Kilmarnock, I've done 35 mediations and from Kilmarnock, and 27 of those have settled. The last one was in fact yesterday afternoon, where parties were fighting about, parties who were in a relationship with each other were fighting about the custody of a dog. They had been in quite a long relationship. They'd acquired a dog, and it was a very, and I'm not making light of it at all, it was a very traumatic and difficult mediation because there was a lot of emotion behind it, and the parties really sort of were fighting over this dog as one would fight over the custody of a child. It was a very important matter to them, and thankfully we could resolve it for them at mediation. Picking it up from where Michael left off, the matters that he then identifies as being suitable for mediation go to the clerk's office, and I get an email from the clerks with contact details of the parties, email addresses, and sometimes telephone numbers. And I then send them an email. I introduce myself and I explain a bit about the process, although I've gathered that has already been explained to them, so they have a pretty good idea of what they're agreeing to when they agree to go to mediation. I invite them to make contact and have a brief discussion if there's any question they want to ask me specifically about mediation in general. And once I'm satisfied that both parties want to proceed with the mediation, I then send them the agreement to mediate, which they sign and return to me. And then I arrange pre-mediation meetings with both parties. I do this, it's something that I started doing some time ago. It's, I think, perhaps one of the luxuries we have of online or telephone mediation. When the clinic was operating at the sheriff courts, we obviously didn't have that benefit, because the parties would often come to mediation on the day of the case management discussion. That the sheriff would offer them the option of mediation, and I would be there, or any other mediator at the other courts, and we would immediately commence the mediation process at court. That meant, of course, that you had no pre-mediation meetings, and you went into the mediation cold, as it were. Now, I think there's an enormous benefit for everybody, but particularly the mediator, in having a pre-mediation meeting with the parties, because you can build trust with the parties, which I think is quite important. You can identify what they need to talk about. Often the things that they need to talk about that aren't apparent at the outset. It may not even be part of the actual dispute, part of their claim. It's something it's something ancillary to that. And you're also able to help them at that early stage to start thinking about possible options. What is it going to take to settle the matter? So once we've gone through that process, I then arrange a date and a time for the mediation, which obviously at this stage we either have to do on Zoom or telephonically via a teleconference facility. And I think Charlie mentioned this earlier in his address, I've been doing a bit of research, a bit of a survey, asking the parties. I send them a short form after the mediation, asking them whether they would prefer to have done the mediation face-to-face as opposed to on Zoom or via the telephone. And the results are quite amazing. The parties generally, almost all of them, say that they way prefer remote mediation to meeting face-to-face. So that's a positive, and I think that's something that that we're going to have to consider for the future. Once we are able to get back to the option of face-to-face mediations, we may well want to focus more on online mediation if that is in fact what the parties want. As a bit of an aside here, and talking briefly about what I think is in some ways a little bit of a contentious topic, and that is shuttle mediation. I at one point was very negative towards shuttle mediation, and in fact I still am in certain circumstances. My feeling on shuttle mediation is where the parties request shuttle mediation. You can accept that matter has got an almost zero chance of settling, because if parties are not able to confront each other face to face, not able to talk to each other, not able to look at each other, not even able to speak to each other via teleconference, if that is the case, the chances of them being able to resolve their issues and settle the matter are very, very, very remote. And the difficulty as a mediator is that you often end up as the kind of messenger of bad news between the parties. The parties use you to carry sort of messages backwards and forwards, and you actually become the bad person. You kind of conveying these negative messages. So at one point I was basically not prepared to do shuttle mediations, but then it struck me that shuttle mediation was actually a very useful tool in the mediator's toolbox, because what I then discovered was that where there is not a good relationship between the parties, and when things become a little bit kind of not aggressive but a little bit uncomfortable in a joint session, it's a very good tool to switch to shuttle mediation, because you're actually separating the parties from each other, and as far as the parties are concerned, you can ask them to come back into a joint session at any stage. So they're not hiding behind the shuttle mediation as much as they would be if they'd requested it. And I find that that's very useful. So I've come to accept that shuttle mediation can be a useful way of resolving matters where there is an acrimonious relationship, but not if it's actually requested by the parties. I normally start mediations after the pre-mediation sessions in a joint session, and then take it from there. Sometimes the matter will conclude in one single joint session. Sometimes I put the parties into breakout rooms, and we have private meetings, me with each of the parties, and we play it by ear, and we see how the matter develops and what needs to be said and what needs to be done. Once we get to the end of the matter, if there's a resolution, if the parties reach an agreement, slightly differently to Heloise, I like to try and get agreements sort of signed and sealed and concluded before the parties have a change of heart, because if they've got time to think about the agreement or the proposed agreement that they've reached, and more importantly, if they happen to speak to a friend or family member who says to them, "No, but you should never settle on that basis. You're giving him or her way too much. You just shouldn't do that." If there's time for that reflection, it often means that a party changes their mind, and you then don't have a settlement, and that's actually to the detriment of the parties, because the settlement that they reached in the first place wasn't a bad idea. They just allowed themselves to be influenced by somebody else, and they then changed their minds. So what I do is essentially let the parties conclude basically a verbal or an oral agreement, but the way in which I do it is to record that agreement by me writing down the terms of their agreement, and I go through it with them carefully. I let them kind of determine what the terms are as far as possible. I then read that agreement back to them. This is all during the actual mediation. This is on Zoom or in the teleconference. I read it back to them. I get them both to confirm that that is the agreement, that I've recorded it absolutely correctly. That's the wording that they want. And I then issue a document that I sign, confirming that the parties concluded that agreement. I read it back to them. They confirmed that that is their agreement. And then you essentially have what is an oral agreement that is recorded. So there's proof of what the parties actually agreed. And I find that way you avoid the risk of the parties having a change of heart. Finally, on the point of the survey and Zoom mediation as opposed to face-to-face mediation, I thought it may be important to read one of the comments that I received back from one of the parties on this survey that I did, because I think that this particular comment actually encapsulates a lot of what parties are looking for and why they are more satisfied with online mediation. This comment is, "I personally would prefer remote mediation going forward, even after the pandemic. I found it incredibly convenient and less time consuming, as it eliminates the need to travel. I personally feel Zoom to be the most cost-effective and environmentally friendly method. Zoom is a very simple app to use. The sound is clear, the images are clear, and there's an option to speak with the mediator privately if required. If one party does not attend, then there's been no time wasted traveling for the other parties. I also feel it may ease any potential anxiety either of the parties may have, as it is not face-to-face. My personal preference would be using Zoom going forward, even after the pandemic." And that is but one comment, but I've received a number of comments in similar vein. So it seems that the most of the parties that are doing online and telephone mediations are in fact very satisfied with the process, and it seems that may be something to look at in the future. Right, I see we've received some questions in. If we can go back to the first one, I think Michael, you may have in part answered this, but maybe if Heloise would like to, I think the question came in while Heloise was doing her presentation. It's from Victoria, and it's, "What criteria do you use to assess whether any particular case is suitable?" So Heloise, can you respond to that, please? You just need to unmute. There you go.
Okay. Yeah, I think the main issue that I'm looking at is to ensure that the parties are making an informed decision to take part, that they're willing, and they're entering in they have the right mindset whereby they're willing to look at compromise and listen to the other person. They're not too entrenched. I would have concerns sometimes if there are cases where there's quite a big power imbalance. For example, there's been violence between parties who were maybe previously in a relationship. I think they're probably the main two sort of criteria that I would use to see if the case is suitable. I mean, sometimes there's just not enough information being provided, so I'll ask the parties to provide that first, and then look at the situation after.
Excellent. Thanks, Heloise. Ailish has asked a question. I think it's directed at me. When do you check if the parties have authority to settle? Ailish, I would normally do that at the pre-mediation meetings, because I do like to know that, you know, if we go into the mediation, that they're not going to get to the end and say, well, you know, this might be a good settlement, but I just actually have to contact my director or my boss or somebody else to get settlement authority. So I would no later than the pre-mediation meeting would I want to know that they've got authority to settle, or that they're able to get it easily, if they don't actually have that authority. There's another question aimed at me from Hazel. Did people explain on the form why they prefer remote mediation? I think, Hazel, would that last comment that would that have explained that? Excellent. And then Lynn says, can you say more, Patrick, risk of change of heart? If they change heart, agreement may fail. I'm not sure, Lynn, did I canvass that, or do you want a further explanation?
No, I was really referring to a discussion that I think we've had in other places, or that some of us have had in other places, which is that sometimes we feel that we must finish the mediation in a particular time, particularly face to face within the day, and lock in having the agreement. And I certainly had a discussion with co-mediators as well. You know, maybe we need to give people more time, because they need to have to be sure about their agreement before they sign on the dotted line. So when you said, well, you know, if we don't get them to capture it now, then there's a risk that they may change their mind. So I was just wondering whether we could perhaps say a little bit more about what is the risk of people changing their mind, and how we handle that. You know, do people change their mind after they've signed up to an agreement and we just say, well, you've signed it? Or, you know, because one of the things I found with Zoom is that if people aren't quite sure, it's an advantage. You can just give them a wee bit more time, and it's quite easy to come back together again. Whereas in the old days, of face-to-face coming back together again was really difficult.
Yeah. Look, it's a good question, and perhaps the easiest way to answer it is to say the following. When I say that I don't like to give parties a chance to change their mind, obviously I'm conscious of the fact that in cases where parties, if I feel that a party is unsure about the settlement that they're trying to achieve, if I think that you know, if I'm concerned that one of them might be agreeing to something that they don't really want to agree to, they might feel pressurized, or whatever other reason there might be for that, I would then actually say, I think you should maybe contact a solicitor, or contact citizens advice, or go somewhere and get some advice, or you need time to think about the matter. So that's not my concern. My concern is that sometimes people conclude perfectly good agreements that you know, which is going to work for both of them. But if you let them sit on it, there's the risk that they go and speak to somebody, and that person says, look, I don't think you should do that, or they just have a change of heart. It's in legal terminology, it's called buyer's remorse. It's the person who buys a house, and the moment they've signed the contract, they regret buying it, not because they don't want it, because it's just the way people react. So I try to avoid that. But if I think that there's a chance that they may need time to reflect, then of course they must have that chance and not sign the agreement at you know, on the day.
It was that balancing act that I was getting at.
Yeah. Okay, so I hope that clarifies. Right, I think that's all the questions in the chat box. Are there any other questions? You can just ask questions verbally if you have a question. Anybody? Any questions? we've still got about 20 minutes, so we've got plenty of time to answer questions. Well, while you're thinking about any other questions, maybe I can just share with you something. Charlie was talking earlier about the activist mediator, and it's something that I really believe in, particularly in simple procedure, because in simple procedure you actually do the parties a favor if you help them try and resolve the matter, because they really do want to resolve it. I mean, they're normally fighting over relatively small amounts of money. There's often principle involved, and parties are their own worst enemies. They often put themselves in a position where, as a matter of principle, they now can't move. They can't. They kind of work hard to try and achieve a settlement, and then they get to a point, and then they've put themselves in a corner. One particular matter I had, it was a Kilmarnock matter, and it goes back to prior to the lockdown, prior to the pandemic, and it was actually at the court one Friday morning during the simple procedure case management discussions. And I actually had a student mediator with me, and we were mediating this matter in the upstairs consulting rooms. And the parties did very well. They moved from far apart to within about, I think it was either 50 or 100 pounds of each other. But they made that fatal error of the one party saying, you know, I'll give you 500 pounds, and that's absolutely my final offer. I'm not budging a penny after that. And of course, the other party falls into the trap, and he says, well, 600 pounds is my absolute limit. I'm not dropping a penny lower than that. So now they both said that's the absolute limit. Whoever now backs down loses face. And so the parties are there. They desperately want to settle this thing. They've moved a long way, and now they can't get over the hurdle because they put themselves in a spot. So they say, well, that's it. We're just not going to resolve this. Let's go back to the sheriff. So I said, no. I said, we've spent a long time here trying to resolve this matter. You've come very close. I said, you've got a choice. You either split the difference or you toss a coin. And unanimously, they said, we toss a coin. And they tossed the coin. They got a result. And then the other party said, well, you won the toss of the coin, but actually I'll split the difference with you so I can also come to the party. And they were very, very happy with their settlement. And I think that's particularly in simple procedure, when those kind of issues arise, that's what Charlie's talking about, the activist mediator. We're not being evaluative. We're not deciding who's right and who's wrong. That's evaluative. What we're doing is we're actually saving the parties from themselves. We're saving them, putting themselves in a spot where they actually want to settle, but now they can't because of principle. And just about 2 weeks ago, I had a very similar matter involving a similar sort of situation, doing this on Zoom. The parties had also come a long way. They'd had a very good discussion about this, and they also painted themselves in a corner. But you kind of also have to read parties as a mediator. I mean, you really do need to have a sort of a gut feel about what you can do and what you can't do. And I just felt this was a case where I would also want to say toss a coin, but I couldn't, not with these parties. They just wouldn't work. The parties at that stage were in breakout rooms. So I said to the one party, actually, the respondent, I said to her, you know, it's a pity you're really close, and I understand what you're saying. It's now a matter of principle. And I told her the story about tossing a coin and splitting the difference or tossing a coin. And I said to her, I really, you know, would like to suggest that here, but I don't think I can with you and the claimant. I don't think you're the kind of people, you know, to whom that would be appropriate. So I say to her, can you think of any way, now that I've told, can you think of any way of resolving this? So she says, yeah, I can. What I'll do is I'll pay the amount that I've offered to the claimant, and I'll pay the balance of the amount that he's asking for to a charity of his choice. It was about 100, I think it was 130 pounds, 135 pounds. I said, okay, so I took it back to him in a breakout room, and I explained the situation to him, and you know, I said that's what she suggested. And he thought about it and he said, it's an excellent idea, but she must then donate £250 to a charity of my choice. In other words, pay me, in other words, so she was paying about £100, £115 more than she would have had to pay him if she was accepting the proposal that he'd put on the table. So I took it back to her and I said, look, he's accepted your proposal in principle, but he actually wants £250 to go to a charity of his choice. And she said, you know what? He's very big on his charities and his business supports a lot of charity. I've got absolutely no problem with that. And the matter settled. So again, I think, you know, we need to, and that's what Charlie was talking about, the activist mediator. We need to actually, as I said earlier, save these parties from themselves. They want to be helped. They want you to help them settle. We're not pushing them. We're just trying to find a way for them to get over these hurdles that they create for themselves, such as, you know, principle. I can't do this. I'm not budging. I'm not going to let him see that you know, that I'm sort of bowing to his demands. So this is really what we need to deal with. Mm-hmm. So, any more questions? Anything? Anybody got? It doesn't seem that you've had any questions for Sheriff Michael Hanlon in this workshop. If he's waiting to answer all your questions.
No,
there. You haven't got any.
Don't feel obliged now.
I've got a question for him.
Oh.
It's Victoria here.
Yeah, Victoria. Thank you.
You said at any stage in the process you could make the referral for mediation. I just wondered if you ever repeated that with people who'd already turned it down. I mean, is it something you would revert to as an idea? Or does that just become sterile?
It's not something I would necessarily rule out. I've never done it because I think that it is quite a process to go through, and you know, you also have another obligation on the sheriff is to try and resolve cases as quickly as possible. And I think you do start to eat into time if you say, okay, well, we'll stop this again and send it away. So I wouldn't ever rule it out, but I've never done it before. What I do is for people who haven't gone to mediation, I do follow the rules, and I think it's a good idea, even as the evidence comes out. So I adjourned a case the other day after a day's worth of evidence, and I stressed again to parties, look, the idea of negotiation doesn't stop just because the case has started. I am still happy, if you want, on the next occasion, to try and help and see if we can come to some sort of settlement. I think I'd be more reluctant to refer them to Patrick or someone else, except in extreme circumstances in those cases, because the evidence has kind of come out, and I think it would be easier for me with that background to be able to refer them to evidence that's come out and why it might help or hinder their case. So it's not something I would rule out, but not something I've ever done.
I'll ask a follow-up question, which is whether you ever have any difficulties that when it actually mediation's been tried and didn't succeed and it goes to trial, people trying to bring in, well, he said at the mediation, you know, breaching the confidentiality of it, basically. Does that ever cause a problem?
Not so much. Patrick, I think, is pretty clear in the fact that it's confidential, and most of them know that when they come to me. If they start going into that, I would pretty quickly cut them off and say, well, look, that is confidential. I'm not getting into it. It's you know, we're really just looking at what the evidence you're presenting here is. So I wouldn't allow them to go into it. It doesn't happen very often. I know
you wouldn't allow them to. I'm just wondering whether it must be very frustrating if someone has effectively admitted the claim in mediation and then says something completely different in their evidence at court. That must be deeply frustrating to the party. I know you wouldn't admit it. I just wondered if it ever came up as an issue.
No, not to that extent, no. I think maybe once or twice somebody's began to kind of touch on, well, they said at the mediation they might be willing to pay a bit, but not to the point where they're saying the breach is, sorry, the claim has been admitted or they're lying. I've never been presented with that kind of situation, fortunately.
Yeah, thanks.
On the point of confidentiality, I had an interesting situation fairly recently. I always stress confidentiality to the parties, and I basically say to them, you know, anything that's said at the mediation can't be taken back to court. You can't. And then after the pre-mediation meeting, I was looking there was a contract that was the basis of the claim, and I was trying to get more information on the contract. And so I asked one of the parties if she could please email me the contract. And the response I got was a very polite response, but a very sort of guarded response. She said, well, she'd love to share that with me, but if she sends me the contract, then she can't refer to it at court if the matter doesn't settle. And of course, I had to explain to her that's not what's meant about the confidentiality. Of course, if you use documents at the mediation that are not created for the mediation, but if you use and I had to explain that whole point. So I actually started rethinking how I explain confidentiality to the parties, because you don't want them to get that idea and then sort of not be forthcoming with information and a discussion at the mediation, because they're afraid that anything they say, even factually, they can't then repeat in court, which obviously is not the case.
Yeah, that's
here, Lynn, you've got a question I see for Michael. How can we best encourage all sheriffs to be as supportive of mediation as you?
I don't know. I mean, I would have thought that most of them would have been as supportive. It's another kind of tool that you can take out and use to help persuade people and settle cases. So it would surprise me if there were many that were resistant to it, but I suppose everybody else here might have better experience. I can only see it from one point of view. I suppose, like everything else, it's education, giving examples. The idea of introducing it is still relatively new, and when mediation was introduced, it's in the simple procedure cases. It tends to be summary sheriffs that are dealing with it. The summary sheriffs are a relatively new branch of the judiciary, so maybe it's just taking a bit of time to filter through, and some of the, I don't want to say old guard, but some of the people who have been in post for a longer period of time, maybe it's not something that they're as quick to turn to because they are more used to the traditional way of dealing with things. So I would imagine a kind of combination of education at the Judicial Institute, as well as just the passage of time and people who are becoming more used to it, might assist.
And I think to follow up on that, and I mentioned it at the previous workshop, it was sometime late last year, the clinic was approached by the Sheriff Principal of the South Strathclyde, Dumfries and Galloway Sheriffdom, asking, if there was a possibility of setting up the mediation service in that sheriffdom, and various meetings followed. The last of which was a question and answer session that I attended with Charlie and Pauline about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And as from the 1st of February, that Sheriff Principal has in that sheriffdom, which I think, Michael, you may know better, I think there are 5 courts in that sheriffdom.
Well, Hamilton, Lanark, Ayr, Dumfries. I think you're right. I think it is.
I think there are 5 courts. From the 1st of February, they're going to also try and identify, I think at an early stage, which cases may be suitable for mediation, and then refer those to the clinic. So it is, I think as the idea gets out there and sheriffs can see the benefits for everybody, for the parties, for the courts, I think that more and more of them will actually be supportive. I don't think it's that they're not supportive. I think in many instances it's just that they didn't know that is an option, that service is available. And up until probably fairly recently, the clinic actually hasn't had the capacity. We certainly wouldn't have the capacity to deal with all of those cases on a face-to-face basis. But now that COVID has determined the direction of our future in some ways, I think that it's becoming more and more feasible to take on more work in the clinic, because we also now have the option of involving mediators who've been part of the clinic, who've done the master's course, and have been from overseas countries and have returned there. We're now able to actually lock into those resources because of the option of using Zoom. A lot of the students on the master's course, I would say at least a half, if not more, are actually foreign students from all over the world, from Canada, India, Germany, Poland, all over the place. And the moment they returned home after their studies, we lost their capacity in the clinic, and now we're actually able to start reconnecting with those mediators, and there are several of them that are actually mediating. There's one fellow in India who's quite regularly involved in the clinic, and there are others who are slowly becoming involved. So that will increase the capacity and enable us to perhaps extend to more and more sheriff courts.
Mm-hmm. I suppose that's the advantage of Zoom from the perspective of mediators, I think, as well as the parties, that can be much further spread and to get into more remote areas where I think face-to-face mediation.
Absolutely. John, you have a question?
Yeah, it was just a quick comment, maybe, and question to Michael. I'm one of those students doing the masters at the moment, but I'm not from a legal background, and I was just wondering if, Michael, would you have any thoughts of how the courts might be able to help mediators be able to adopt that activist approach by developing their knowledge and understanding of how the courts work, you know, particularly for somebody like me, not from a legal background?
In what way, what kind of aspects? You mean procedurally, or knowledge of the kind of legal aspects of a case, or?
Yes, procedurally, really, you know, and to allow me to help perhaps give information to the parties involved on what might happen if the case were to go back to court, for instance. You know, I know that might come with experience, but
yeah.
would the courts be able to help in a way and do a bit more to help prepare mediators to fulfill that role?
Well, I mean, I think probably your first port of call and your best port of call would be to contact the sheriff principal for the court sheriffdom that you're working in, to see whether or not maybe a sheriff would be willing to sit down and chat you through what's going on. Certainly, if that approach were made to me, I'd be more than happy to sit down and have a chat about what the general principles are and how a case will go through the various stages. So that would be the first kind of port of call. I suppose the other thing you might want to do is, as most of these cases come from the simple procedure rules, just Google the rules themselves. The simple procedure rules are available on the court website, Scottish Courts website, and a Google search will show them up. And one of the big things about rules when they were written is that they wanted them written for parties who are not used to going to court and in quote unquote layman's terms. So they're done in a question and answer session. So literally, how do I make an application? What happens to my case once it's at court? What is a case management discussion? That's how the rules are written. Those are the rules that I have to follow and apply. So I would suggest probably a combination of both: reading the rules first of all, and then perhaps speaking to the sheriff principal about speaking to a sheriff, or even once you've read the rules, go down and once COVID is allowing us back into courts, watching the process, finding out when the local courts have those hearings, and just seeing the rules being put into practice.
Excellent, thank you. Anything else? We've got about a minute left. Anybody else got a question? Okay, well, thank you, everybody. I hope that all your questions are answered.